So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then I'll introduce our second speaker when it's time for him. I know Stephen McKay is on board. I know Roger Ort is here, and I'm pretty sure I saw Eric Schellenberg. So these folks are the ones with the real experience growing these plants, and they're here so that if we do have some questions as we go along, I'm sure they'll be able to jump in and contribute to that. So let me just go ahead and share. So, and you can minimize the speaker bar if you'd like to, so that you can just see the presentation. But so I'm going to just start out talking about what constitutes commercial viability. And that's a really important question for these particular plants. And before we talk about that, I just want to give recognition because this is an unusually diverse group of plants. And I want to recognize that commercial viability isn't the only reason that, or profit or those kinds of things aren't the only reason that people might consider growing these plants. Many, not all of them are, but many of these plants are native plants, and they have a really important place in indigenous cultures, their culture, their food sources. And so I just want to recognize that that might be a real driving force for growing them and not so much about commercial viability. And then recognizing also that some of these plants are not natives and they may pose ecological risks as we expand culture of them. And so we'll talk about those that have already been recognized, and maybe there's some attributes that you already realize could be problematic from an environmental standpoint as far as an invasive nature of the plants. A lot of these plants are really important pollinators. They bloom when other things are not blooming. And that is a very important reason to grow them, just for that alone. They may be useful in reducing soil erosion, especially for those of us that live in rather hilly areas. That's a really important attribute as well. Woody plants are going to become more and more important in terms of carbon capture and ways that farmers might be able to help mitigate some of the problems associated with climate change. And I think that this is something that we can keep in the back of our mind. I'm hopeful that maybe we'll even get some kind of cost sharing for some of these types of plantings. We will see. But that's another reason to grow them. Increasing biodiversity out in your farm, very, very important. Expansion of our human diets and expanding them, and also recognizing that some of these plants are really important to immigrant groups as far as a food source and part of their natural diet. And then impact on wildlife. I mean, in this as a pro and a con, I think. Growing these plants may actually blow up certain sectors of wildlife because there's an additional food source. But for those of us who really value wildlife, and birds included, these are other sources of food for those things. So these are beyond the commercial reasons that we would grow these fruit. And again, what are uncommon fruits? And basically, they're fruit that have really interesting histories. On the resource list, oh, and I forgot to go to the Teachable site, but I'll try to remember to do that before we're done because we've got a lot of resources that are listed there. And then some of those resources actually have the histories of these plants, where they're from, and all of that is really important to know from a production standpoint so that you can relate that to your customers, but just for your own edification when you're growing them, it's really fun to know that. A lot of these plants do tend to be quite pest resistant and often are very hardy in our landscape. So those are attributes that we want to recognize. Often that pest resistance, if we start to grow more and more of them, and monocultures have a tendency to break down that pest resistance. So understanding that that might not always hold true if you plant 5 acres of something in a monoculture. A lot of these plants have high levels of antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, etc. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about that, but that's one of the big values of growing them. And one of the limitations is the availability of planting material. It's often hard to find them. These can be hard to come by, difficult to propagate on your own, but still we'll talk about where to find them and where to source the plants. And lists of resources will also be in that Teachable website. They often have unique flavor profiles, and we'll discuss a little bit about what that means and how that impacts commercialization, because our palate, especially in the United States, has become to really value high sugar. And these often don't have high sugars. They may be high tannins, rather bitter, but some people really enjoy that. And so let's talk about why they don't lend themselves to commercialization. And productivity is one of the things, and remembering what brings, what does that mean? Usually when we talk about a plant being productive, it means that you have reliable harvests and you have good yield almost every single year. A lot of these plants don't bear reliably every single year. So that's a big challenge, but there's ways that we can kind of circumvent that horticulturally, and we don't have a lot of the different breeding that's been done. A lot of that hasn't been done. We don't have rootstocks that would help encourage fruiting or reduce that juvenile period. But those are things we will, as we talk about each different sector, we will talk about that. Ease of harvest is a huge problem. I think some of these plants have very long ripening periods, so that it's difficult to come in with a crew and just kind of harvest everything all at once. That makes it maybe more amenable to a U-pick market. And some of them, when I say ease of harvest, I also mean that they're very thorny, or they're very rapid and vigorous vegetatively, so that the plants get to be quite large. So that's a little bit of a challenge. They may have a difficult time coming off of the plant, or difficult to try to figure out when they're actually ripe. So all of that goes into the ease of harvest. The years to production, that juvenile period is really important to trying to have a commercial planting become viable. So we usually are looking for plants that have rather short juvenile periods, and we've been able to circumvent that by using different rootstocks to shorten that. But that's going to vary. Again, the availability of the planting material, we'll talk a lot about that. Most of these are available, but they're not overly available. The marketability, again, goes to that flavor profile, maybe even how well they store, and there's a wide range of attributes for each of the plants that we'll discuss. The potential for value-added products is enormous. We know that many of these plants are highly valued for nutraceuticals. They have high rates of antioxidants, and they can be added. Again, their flavor profile makes it so that they really add depth to many other more commercially known products. So whether it's in juices or alcoholic beverages or jams and jellies, and even teas. Some of the very best tea I've ever had was the Aronia tea that Steve McKay served, and I bought some extra of that. Really phenomenally good tea. So those value-added products and potential is there. And then all of the plant growth characteristics that would impact perhaps harvestability definitely will play in. So that is how we start to kind of gauge whether or not the plants are suitable for commercialization. But one of the things that's really important to know is understanding what the ORAC values are. These are a USDA value that has, it's the oxygen radical absorbance capacity of the fruit. This particular chart shows aronia as being hugely, this is per 100 grams, hugely more valuable from an ORAC standpoint than a lot of our other juices. And we've got lots of other berries that we'll be talking about that have similar or slightly less ORAC values. But these things, the radical absorbency, those oxygenated compounds that are released from our body when we are under stress, they've been implicated in a lot of health issues, from everything from neurological problems, including Alzheimer's, to cancers. So these things in our diet are really, really important, and hence all the encouragement to eat really highly colored fruits and vegetables in our diet include that. But these plants have extraordinary capacity to provide those ORAC and antioxidants to our diet. So now we kind of touched on why these plants could be challenging, and as we delve into them, and this is a picture of beach plum for those of you who might not have seen it, and that wasn't on the original agenda, but we will be talking about that briefly. So we've added that. And if you have other plants that you didn't see on the agenda that you'd really like to have included, we will try our best. We've already got a very packed agenda, but we will try to add them, and you can certainly ask about them during the question and answer period. So let me just start talking about site selection. And this is really from the perspective of all kinds of fruit plants. It's really important to consider these. And we'll talk about soil quality and land use history, the water availability, the location, proximity to markets, availability to labor to pick these is huge, and the price of land, and the farm's current situation. And we can talk a little bit more about what that means when we get to that. So I would say that this is absolutely the most important factor in crop production of any kind, and certainly in perennial crops and specialty crops like fruit. Soil quality is really, really important. Soils can determine the vigor and potential yield of your crops. It can help if you have a lighter soil, it can actually get earlier production and earlier bearing. And it might, if you have a little bit heavier soils, it might actually keep the plant from blooming so early, although heavier soils are really just very difficult to deal with. But ultimately, all of this has an impact on the investment that you have to make in order to get that yield and that acceptable economic return. And so all of that is really important. I used to tell farmers that if you own land and the soil quality is poor, I used to say, well, sell it. I really feel that strongly. But from the perspective of valuing a place and kind of recognizing how important that is to all of us, not just indigenous communities, but all of us, that place that we live and farm, that's really, really important. So I just want to recognize that selling a piece of ground is just a lot easier said than done, especially if you love it and it's your home. So there are ways that we can kind of circumvent that by using raised beds, by tiling ground if it's a little heavy, by just adding organic matter, improving the soil tilth. Those are ways that we can circumvent some poorer, and usually when I say poorer, I mean heavier ground. But we also have to keep in mind that that's something we have to address. And where can you find information about soil? And the Web Soil Survey, we'll go to that in just a second. I'm going to stop sharing this screen and then go back to that. Actually, maybe we'll wait and do that just in case people haven't seen that. I want to make sure you know where that is. the soil nutrient analysis that we do is very, very important as a pre-plant and even a site selection on top of your farm. And if you really want to delve deeper, doing a soil health test is a good way to kind of get a little bit more in-depth information. I especially think this can be helpful when you're dealing with soil that's been used a lot. For instance, if you're got a dairy farmer that's and they've been farming on that ground for a long time, and you buy the property, compaction and just just very low organic matter and some of the things that go along with overused soil can be kind of picked apart by using a soil health test. Whereas the nutrient analysis that you did from a ground that's been heavily fertilized could be great, but it still may not be in the best situation for planting. So that's just another kind of a tool that we can use. Past cropping history is really important for these plants. A lot of these plants will be rather sensitive to soil-borne diseases and or herbicide residue. So that's really important to know what's been there. Observation. Nothing takes the place of observing the property. So if you really know that you've got a site that's a little bit it's susceptible to frost both in the early spring and the fall, that's going to be something that you should kind of take note of. A lot of the plants that we're going to talk about in this series of workshops are very, they have unusual and early bloom times, which makes them kind of good. That's a good thing because we can get to the market early. Some of these will be some of your earliest fruit on the market, making them very desirable. But a lot of that can be nipped in the bud by some spring frost times. And talk to people that know your ground. If you are a brand new owner to the ground, you haven't been there for very long, trying to find out as much as you can about it by people that have lived there in the past, by people that have farmed it. Kind of your last person to ask is your realtor, because they don't think about it always in terms of crop production, but anybody you can find that will know it. Observing it and talking to people who have used it are helpful. So just quickly, soil terminology. We talk about land capability, and class 1 soils have virtually no limitations, and I'll show you a picture that'll describe what this means. But class 6 and higher have really severe limitations, and you would never think about growing crops. We'll talk a little about soil texture and soil structure. And this is a rather poor picture, but it just talks about class 1 land is right here in the middle. That's a very level, easy access to a stream, perhaps that's right here, some kind of source of water. Class 2 is other really great crop production ground. Class 3 land is often readily flooded, so that's usually in a floodplain. Can be really great silty soils, but sometimes can be hard to manage and unpredictable. And then class 5 and 4 land have some rolling area to it. Maybe they're also prone to flooding. And then once you get up here, this is just mostly elevation, very little topsoil because of the slope that really makes it unusable mostly for a crop that has to be tilled a lot. So that's the great thing about our plants that we'll talk about. Mostly once you've established these, they're long-lived. They can be grown on some relatively slopey ground because we don't normally have to get tillage equipment in there, but you do have to get spray equipment perhaps, or mowing equipment, or any kind of harvest platforms if you're going to use something like that. So just keep that in mind. Slope is not always our friend. A lot of you probably, if you're not new to farming, you certainly understand this chart. This just gives you an idea of what soil texture is, and we are looking for primarily things that are in the sandy loam. Maybe they have a little silty clay loam, but usually not into the 70% clay or even above 50% clay. That gets to be a very heavy soil, very challenging to work with. We have a lot of soil-borne disease problems, and some of that is not even known on these plants, but free water in, wet, boggy soil is just really a challenge to work with, and tends to create problems on every front. And then other soil considerations would be the depth of the soil. Deep and well drained are always preferred for almost everything. A slope that does not exacerbate erosion and runoff problems. Organic matter that's well above 2% is really a good idea. And pH that is usually in the kind of the range of about 6 to 6.5. And organic matter levels can be, we can work at that. We can raise organic matter to some extent, but it's really important. It is done through a lot of work with cover cropping. And so this is all in site preparation, adding that and thinking about how you can improve organic matter so that you can get good nutrient uptake, decrease erosion, and just improve the vigor of your plant. pH is measured on a 0 to 14 scale. pH has significant impact on the availability of soil nutrients, and most of our horticultural crops, usually the pH is 6.5. Really between 6.0 and 6.5 are mostly ideal, but not all of that is true for all of the crops, especially the ones that will be growing. Here's this kind of, most of you are familiar with this chart, I'm sure. These are the macro and micronutrients that are important for plant growth. And on the bottom of this chart is the pH range. And you can see that once we get up into the 6.5 range, that's when most all of these micro and macronutrients are available at very good rates. So pH affects that. And you can alter pH to some degree, but it's hard to make huge changes. So if you have very acidic soil that will need to be constantly limed and trying to improve that pH, that's going to be, continual work, and it's just an added expense from the labor standpoint and from an input standpoint. So trying to make sure you understand that before you start growing on them is important. Herbicide carryover for our kind of the plants in the rosaceous family that I deal a lot with, especially strawberries and raspberries. These herbicides can be really challenging for them. They cause a lot of stunting and dwarfing and very poor establishment. So making sure you know what's been used on that ground at least 3 years, often 5 years ahead of time, is important. Herbicide screenings are expensive, but you can use a germination test to try that out. Beans are commonly used. You can even grow strawberries, a couple pots of strawberries and see what happens. That will definitely tell you. And the other thing with other carryovers are just that history of planting. So making sure that you know if there have been rosaceous and solanaceous plants, which the common soil-borne diseases that we worry about are verticillium, Phytophthora, Fusarium, Rhizoctonia, and they may not have any impact at all on some of these plants that we're going to talk about, but some of them may be impacted. So water supply is really important. The location and quality, water is important. Obviously, we're using it for irrigation and mixing pest control sprays, cooling, washing the crop. All of that is deemed agricultural water. So a good quality and good quantity resource is important. Surface water, we use surface water a lot in crop production, but surface water quality changes. Even the quantity and availability of that can change year to year. So you want to make sure to retest irrigation supplies. We're not going to talk too much about food safety concerns in this workshop series, but if you do have any questions about food safety, water is a real That's one of the high risk elements of crop production from a food safety standpoint. And many of these plants will not be necessarily eaten out of hand. They may be used in a specialty crop so that once they're cooked or heated at all, they kind of, that removes the risk. But if you're planning on selling these as a fresh market crop that is eaten raw, then we have to start thinking about food safety concerns. And we will kind of talk about that periodically, I'm sure. But measuring salinity or EC, the sodium absorption level of water, and toxins, if you know that there might be some toxins in there, that's important to measure that in your water supply. Nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus are classically the ones that we're concerned about. And even the pH of your water, that will have an impact on how effective your pest control agents are. A lot of them don't like to have really alkaline or really acidic water to be mixed with. So knowing that in advance is important. So a hardiness zone map, probably a lot of you have seen that. Most of these plants are very hardy in the temperate region. And then there is going to be some of the impact on viability and whether or not we can actually grow them predictably will be the impact of hardiness and the flowering time on those plants. So just making sure that at least we can grow them in a zone 6 and above. You can see that most of New York is in zone 6, or there's very few areas right in the Adirondacks that might be in a zone 3, but most of us are able to grow zones 5 and 4 plants very easily. Zone 6 in the lower Hudson Valley. Those lucky dogs on Long Island can grow in zone 10. And then a lot of people that, or not zone 10, 7, I mean, and a lot of people who are in urban areas that might want to have smaller plantings, often urban areas or in certain little special little microclimates in rural areas can, you might have a hardiness zone that's very different than this hardiness zone map implies. So the length of the growing season, this is kind of an average, although I dare say that our average first frost date is definitely changing. Last frost date really has been variable all over the last couple of years. We have had frost later in May, like we normally saw in the late 80s or early 80s. But that length of growing season is going to be really important to ensuring crop maturity and quality. And I guess a limited growing season can make your marketing your crop easier. I guess that's a positive way to think about it. But this is from the Internet Accuracy Project. This talks about medium length of freeze-free period. Mostly we're in this 121 to 180 days freeze-free, which allows us to ripen most of the crops that we're going to talk about pretty accurately, pretty reliably. But this is what's been happening over time, and I'm sure you've seen it if you're farming, that our average length of our seasons have been increasing by days and weeks even over the last 30 years. Dramatic with no end in sight, which seems like it could offer a lot of great possibilities, but the problem is that our ability to keep things in dormancy and fulfilling chilling units and keeping things from busting out of dormancy is really, that's where it becomes very challenging. This year seems to be kind of what we might have referred to as an old-fashioned winter because we haven't had so much of that freeze-thaw cycling. But now let's talk about labor and equipment needs. Every one of us who's in farming, or actually if you're in any kind of employment, human labor is really expensive. And with these kinds of specialty crops, it's often the only way to accomplish harvest or whatever task you're dealing with. This picture is of a recumbent harvester in strawberries, and some of these more unique small scale equipment is being is becoming more available. I wouldn't say it's readily available, but it is still very difficult to find. But there are things that are out there that might help you kind of circumvent the labor. And Steve McKay is a great person to talk about. You know, I don't know if he's going to have any time to discuss this at all, but he works with H2A, securing H2A labor, which is very important to our commercial fruit industry and specialty crops. The other thing to consider is that all of these crops, these fruit are perishable. And so your distance from your farm to your market is really important. Crop requirements from a post-harvest perspective, that seasonality of harvest and the manner of harvest impacts how you're going to store it and whether or not you're going to be able to keep it on the shelf too long. And then the type of that final market, whether you're going directly to your consumer or whether you are going into a processing kind of plant, that affects how you harvest, it affects how you market, and it may affect how you even grow these plants, knowing that end of the market. And then this is the other considerations of growing that. When we talk about property taxes and planning and zoning, all of this, these kind of fixed costs are part of what makes things really viable. Can we do it? Can we make a profit on these plants? And it makes it difficult to do that. I am going to say that facilities and buildings for handling and storage, as well as marketing, and we've got a couple of pictures just of local barns. And this is commonly what I find is a lot of people have older barns that were built for probably animal or livestock farming. And they can be outfitted into really great facilities, but it does require a lot of effort. So just think about what goes into handling, making a refrigerated building, making storage for your equipment. All of that is important. And I didn't really talk about trellising or some of those other infrastructure type changes you might have to make. Machinery we discussed very quickly, and just the cost of everything that goes into the price of the initial land when you purchase it. That in and of itself could be prohibitive. We are in such an unusual time where we're up against solar arrays along with housing, along with other commercial agricultural ventures. So good land is really expensive, basically. So in summary, do your homework, start small, stay organized, and I think loving the process is really important. Just so that you guys know, the PowerPoints will also be available. That'll include some of the notes that might be helpful to you, but we're definitely going to have the recording posted. I do want to share one last thing. I want to make sure to talk about the Teachable site. And I thought I had that. I'll have to make sure the web soil survey. So before I introduce Steve, so you can talk about really what you're here for, not about all that kind of perfunctory beginning part. This is the Teachable site where we have all the resources for you guys. All these different tiles are of other virtual courses that we've offered. You may not see all of them because you may only be logged into this particular uncommon fruit. But when you click on that tile, you'll see these different, there's every session, there's general fruit resources that are listed there, which has a really good fact sheet with a bunch of different links. But the live webinar link for this webinar and all of the days will be there. Session details will be included. Resources are going to be listed there. So it's all there. And I just wanted to make sure that you saw that. And maybe we'll wait because I've already gone on longer than I had hoped. Maybe we'll wait and show that web soil survey if people would like to see that at the end. But I don't want to take any more of Stephen's time. I'd like to introduce Stephen McKay. He's a longtime former colleague, friend. He is probably one of the people most responsible for information scientific and research-based information on a lot of the crops that we're going to talk about. He's done a ton of work in ribes, a ton of work with aronia. He owns his own a nursery and specialty crops company. And he is also on his sideline job. He works with trying to procure and help farmers find H2A labor. So Stephen, I want to welcome you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, I have years and years of experience. Actually, my experience with berries began in Finland when I was 18 years old. And I went to visit an exchange student whose mother had a lot of berries planted, and then thought well, why is it we don't have currants? Why is it we don't have gooseberries? I've never seen blueberries like this. And so that was what got me started years and years ago. So anyway, today I guess we're going to be talking about ribes, and I'll be getting the PowerPoint up here in just a minute. I've been through big battles with trying to help ribes become something possible to have here and be viable. When I was teaching in California at the Anderson Valley High School, we started an international ribes association. And so I started to make contact with Europeans. This, of course, was before computers. This was before Zoom. This was even before faxes. And at any rate, at that point, I was able to make contact in England and go and visit one of the largest germplasm collections that they have in the world with gooseberries and currants, and got a permit to be able to import those and bring those back into the US. We planted those ribes, and part of the contract of bringing them here was that we had to have post-entry inspections. And some people from USDA came to inspect our planting when I was away at another place. They said, "Oh, we found mites." And it turned out, well, they thought, oh, they could possibly be big bud mites. And of course they weren't, but they took the precaution to destroy all of the material that I had brought in with that importation. In the meantime, there are bans against importation of black currant because they're two devastating pests that we could have that we think we don't have in North America. One is the big bud mite, and the other is reversion virus. And the thing is, so those are banned, and they have to come in through a long, like 7-year long process, I believe, for being observed and being tested in order to be released and included in our germplasm repository, which is in Oregon. Oregon is where all the ribes are kept at this point. And
Stephen, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure that you are not thinking that we are seeing a presentation right now.
Not yet. I'm just almost ready to do just a little bit of introduction.
I didn't want to. I just wanted to be sure. Okay.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background as to the struggles that have been involved in this whole thing. So anyway, at that point, then they prohibited all ribes from any kind of post-harvest entry, quarantine, and importation. So I was unable to get all of those wonderful crops in again. And so everything is under quarantine, where you have to put them into that 7-year quarantine where the USDA actually handles the quarantine. It's ridiculous, but there's some people who are saying that they don't want to bring in gooseberries because of the possibility of reversion virus. And they've done scientific studies in Europe to show that they don't get reversion virus. But anyway, there's a blockage that I haven't been able to penetrate in order to be able to import those varieties. The other thing, of course, in the Northeast that we're familiar with is white pine blister rust. And when I first came to Cornell Cooperative Extension, I started a campaign to educate people about that disease and to take away a lot of the outdated laws that they had against ribes, saying they thought that, well, anyway, it came to be thought among plant pathologists, white pine blister rust equals death to white pines. And if you have rabies, that means you're going to have white pine blister rust. So we have lots of ecological reasons why it's not the horrible pest. I mean, it's a bad pest, but it's not spread the way that lots of these forest pathologists like to think. And on the teachable section, I've put up a PowerPoint about white pine blister rust. And if anybody has any concerns and would like to talk to me in more detail about that, we were able to eliminate regulations in a lot of the states, but there are still some that hold tightly to those, like Massachusetts and Maine. But at any rate, I'll talk a little bit more about white pine blister rust and why it's not as big a concern as a lot of people make it out to be as we get into the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get my PowerPoint up here, and let's see, I have to do share screen first.
Yep, you're just share your screen, and hopefully if it's open on your computer, it'll be right there.
Yeah, it's open here, and now I just need to get it to play. So how are we doing? It look good?
No, we are not seeing it yet. Did you go to the share screen button? Oh,
yeah.
There we do. There it is. There it is.
Okay.
There.
All right, there's my contact information in case anybody needs to get a hold of me. And again, this, like Laura said, this presentation is available on that Teachable site. So now if I can get it to move forward. Okay, good. So this is the diversity of color and forms that you can find with ribes. Most people aren't aware of those beautiful yellow transparent gooseberries, all of the different sizes and colors. If you look on the lower right-hand side, there's one that's kind of white colored. That's called Langley Gage, and it's the sweetest of the gooseberries. I did Brix tests on all the varieties that I could when I was researching, and that was the sweetest variety, 22 Brix, which when you compare that to something like a peach, that's super sweet. Okay, so classification, it's in the family group Grossulariae, and there are various species of ribes. Ribes nigrum is black currants, ribes rubrum, red currants, ribes grossularia, gooseberries generally, but then there are hybrids of all of these, which have been used to develop the varieties that we're familiar with. When they looked to develop these varieties, they had priority to look for, of course, for high yield, good fruit quality, cold tolerance, later flowering dates. Now, of course, with climate change, some of these goals have changed. Disease resistance, desirable growth habit, and lack of thorns. Some of these plants tend to be very, not very upright and kind of spreading, and so you have to keep clipping them back in order to keep an upright form in them. And then that question about thorns, one of the ways to get around that is if you do what we call a cordon, an upright cordon. And so that's one of the ways, and we'll see some pictures of that as we continue to move on through here. There's your typical black currant, red currant on the vine, and that's Ravada, which is our main commercial variety. And when you're looking at varieties of red currants, I have three favorites that I like. And I like to start out the season with Jonker van Tets, which is a large-sized berry, which is early, and then followed by Ravada, and then there's another variety called Tatran, which is a later variety. White currants, Blanca and Primus are the two that are the most available here. Literally, you know, if you look at the number of varieties that are available actually in existence, over 500 varieties of gooseberries, to give you an idea, and many more of currants. But we only have a few that have been made available here. People try to make available, of course, the most productive and the most disease resistant varieties. Pink currants, pink champagne is the common variety. that is planted. The big problem with pink currants is you get a lot of stem and a little bit of fruit. So when you fill up your baskets, you can see on these plants, this is real typical, that a lot of what they call runoff of the berries has happened. And so it's the tastiest, best tasting white type of currant that there is, but the yield and the thing with having those strigs is a negative characteristic. Again, so many sizes and shapes of gooseberries. These are beautiful fruits that I even one time saw an advertisement in Finland where somebody had made a necklace out of red currants. Okay, so ribes are adapted to a range of conditions. When you look at soil type, a clayey loam, a little bit heavier soil tends to be a little bit better for ribes, but still well drained. I think Laura was right on when she said everything has to be well drained, because for all of these fruits, they don't like to have wet feet. 6.5 pH and an organic matter 3 to 5%. The frost days fits right into our availability here in New York, as Laura had shown. Spring frosts can sometimes be a problem if these bloom early, just like with any other plant. Also, high summer temperatures, and especially in gooseberries, they'll sunburn very easily. So one of the ways that people have gotten around that is to plant underneath grapevines or plums or peaches. Of course, you have to look at your spray schedules and compatibility for these to be able to be compatible. But plums has been a traditional tree crop that's used to shade gooseberries. Of course, you need to check on your legal restrictions, because some still exist. And irrigation, of course, if it's dry. Field pre-plant, work the soil at least 20 inches deep. You can have raised beds or flat beds, plastic mulch, and drip tape are all options. If you're going to be doing cuttings, the best time of the year that I found to do cuttings here in New York is between September 15th and October 15th. Especially with black currants, they root right away. At that time of the year, they can root in as short a time as 1 week. When you do plant from cuttings, you should plant a nursery row so that you can replace any cuttings that don't take, and fill in the skips from the nursery row. Okay. So here's what these cuttings look like. Way back in '99, I did an experiment. And this was an example of titania, which rooted within 5 days. Those are the roots that showed in 5 days. This is how they commercially do it in England. They take unrooted cuttings. Black currants are the easiest to root out of the ribes. And so you probably get 95 to 100% rooting in black currants, whereas in red currants, it's less. It might be somewhere between 50 and 80%, depending on the variety. And the rooting capability is actually variety dependent. Now, gooseberries present a challenge that makes them a lot more difficult than, or they're a lot more difficult than currants. And they're not easy to start with dormant cuttings. What we do is commonly in England is that they use stool beds to do their propagation, but layering and semi-hardwood cuttings are also possibilities. So if you have gooseberries growing in your field, if you just take the long stems and put them down into the soil in the fall with a bit of mulch over them, they'll tend to root. Semi-hardwood cuttings with mist in the greenhouse can also produce rooted plants. For those of you who are not familiar with stool beds, they're made by mounding soil around a mother plant that you've cut in a number of places, and it's highly branched. And as you mound the soil around it, those branches will send out roots, and then you can come back in the fall and dig away the dirt and cut off rooted cuttings. Okay, so I'm just getting used to the scroller here. This is what a planting looks like in Europe in the first year, when those cuttings have been placed through plastic with drip tape. There's a second year growth, and then there's finally what the currants look like in a mature planting. These are commercial plantings that are planted for using harvesters, black currant harvesters, and they need to be planted close enough together so that one plant leans against the next plant as the harvester moves through the field. Let's see. When you're looking at red currants, most people around here will grow red currants for fresh market. And one of the nice ways to do that is by making a 3 cordon plant, triple cordon plant. And so you train, you can see on here 3 cordons, and then there's one other additional 1-year-old branch there. That's used to replace cordons when they get old or if they become diseased. And what you have to do each year is on the cordon, you leave 1-year-old wood that's going to produce your crop, and leave that nicely spaced on the cordon. And one of the keys is to not leave too much wood on there. The currant plants tend to be very productive, and you don't want to overcrowd and overbear. Here's a picture of what these cordons look like with the 1-year-old wood, which will have the fruit on it. And this is inside of a cold frame. The same is done with gooseberries, and it's a helpful thing with the gooseberries because, like Laura said, a lot of times thorns are a big problem. And if you try to pick gooseberries out of an unpruned plant, you'll know what I mean. You get these little tiny tips of the thorns in your fingers that fester and get infected, and is a real pain. So if you can get more thornless types of gooseberries, because some of them have really small thorns, or there are a couple of varieties that have no thorns at all, but the fruit's not that good. So there's still breeding work, I'm sure, people to try to get rid of those thorns. This is in Wisley Gardens in England, where they, instead of leaving 1-year-old shoots, they left spurs, a 2-bud spur to produce the fruit. So both ways are used in England. Here's an adaptation for a sprayer. I just show you some of the equipment they have, a couple of the sprayers that they used in England. And this is what the harvester looks like. What the harvester does is it goes down the row, and it splits the plant into 2 parts. And each side gets shaken by the shakers, which are up inside the plant, or I mean, up inside the harvester. And then they fall down to some conveyor belts that bring the fruit to the back to where it's put into bins. And so bins are actually used when they're doing commercial harvest for juice. Okay, health benefits are talked about a lot, especially for black currants. Black currants are the most nutrient rich of the ribes. And you can see some of the characteristics: 4 times the vitamin C of citrus. Potassium is high, so instead of eating that banana during the summer, you can get a glass of black currant juice and get your potassium that way. High in iron and bioflavonoids. It's another one of those ones that's high. It's not as high as aronia or elderberry, but they're a good source. They have twice as much bioflavonoid as blueberries. And the ORAC units are listed. Also, those bioflavonoids tend to be somewhat stable when heated. So if you have to heat to pasteurize the juice, you don't necessarily lose your antioxidant characteristic. Okay, so range of products is possible through ribes, and dried, frozen, syrup, puree. I have a method that I use for a lot of these berries, for especially aronia and black currant, which I call infusion. And it's where I use my steam kettles in my processing kitchen, and I'll put the berries in there and then put grape juice, deionized grape juice concentrate with it, so that the berries will absorb the sweetness, and then they give off their juice. And so you end up with a nice syrup that has about 36 to 40 bricks. And then you can take the fruit out and dry it and have dried currants. And those dried currants can be used for baked products. I put them in chocolate. And so it really opens up a lot of possibilities. Also, both products are useful in ice cream. So teas, baked goods, desserts, nutraceuticals, the list is huge. And when you go to Europe, you'll find many products that are made with different ribes, especially black currants, and so in some places red currants, and gooseberries are generally just sold fresh, or in something called gooseberry fool or gooseberry yogurt. A really nice yogurt that I've had in Europe is gooseberries and elderflower. And so that's I think a good one that somebody could develop here. Fermented products, wine, cassis, aperitif, and vinegars are really wonderful from these products also. So just a diversity of products. These are some European products. Ribena is kind of a joke because it's considered the black currant product, but it's only 5% black currant juice. So you can do much better than that with something like this Arbo from Austria. Okay, so white pine blister rust. This is definitely a consideration. And what you need to do is you need to study the life cycle. And in that particular slide presentation that is on the teachables, you'll see a picture of the life cycle. And so coming to understand that life cycle, as a plant pathologist, you look for those areas of weakness of transmission. And one of the weakest areas, which I have listed here, is the limited distance that the sporidia can come from the tilia in the fall in order to infect the pines. So what happens is that here's how the life cycle goes. In the springtime, pines give off spores which can travel as far as 350 miles. And so you might not see a white pine anywhere around and say, where is this white pine blister rust coming from? Well, it's flown in the wind, and that's how it's spread. Once the white pine blister rust gets into the black currants, and very slightly sometimes into red currants, then it can multiply. If you have a wet, cool summer, that's the ideal for the propagation of the disease. If it's a hot summer, the disease which has taken place or taken residency on the leaves of the currants will die out. It burns out. And so then it's not even available there in order to make the sporidia, which might have a possibility of infecting pines in the fall. Those sporidia can only travel 1,000 feet. So if you make a border around your black currant planting with no white pines, then there's no way that they can get to the white pines. So you've stopped the disease cycle there. Also, these spores tend to infect the lower 9 feet of a pine tree. So if you have old established pines, they're not going to tend to be affected by having the ribes anyway. And so also there are certain climate zones where they look at what the fall weather is like over a period of time, and then they can say, okay, this is a zone 1 hazard, zone 2 hazard, zone 3 hazard, zone 4 hazard. You want to plant in a hazard zone which has low transmission of those spores, the sporidia from the tilia. And also, so you can say that the pines that are the most susceptible are those that are in nurseries. So the way to avoid that is just make sure you have 1,000-foot border around any pine nursery. Make sure there's no ribes in there, and you won't have a problem. Unfortunately, a lot of foresters don't recognize how many ribes plants are present in the forest, and they had programs to rogue out the ribes that were in the forest before, and then they just continued doing that in 1963 because they said it was ineffective. So you've always got a background possibility of infection. So for those people who are growing white pines in a nursery, the key is to keep a 1,000-foot border. For anybody who's afraid about the sporidia coming from the currants to their pines, keep a 1,000-foot border, and then you'll be fine. There's what it looks like from the top. You see little yellow spots. That happens to be a red currant. And here's a black currant, and this shows what the infection looks like during the summertime. And the infection then will turn, these rusty places will send out little, it looks like a little shoot, and on there is where you'll have the sporidia form that can go to the white pine. The worst thing that can happen is when you have young pine trees planted and white pine blister rust gets established in the trunk, then that can girdle and kill the tree. So you need to make sure that if you're planting white pines as Christmas trees or something like that, that you're free of ribes to avoid having any problem like that. Okay, another disease problem that has shown up in New York, which I haven't kept track of how the disease is going at this point, but it's called cane blight, and it causes sudden yellowing and wilting of branches, and eventually the entire branch will die back, and it's mainly on red and black currants. The key to controlling it is to remove infected canes from the field when you see it starting to multiply. And then also you can use sulfur and copper sprays. This is not a very good picture, but this is what it looks like. The green on the leaves, on the branches dies off, and you see these dead spots in there. And those canes should be removed and buried or burned. Anthracnose is another problem, and I've seen when I've worked with gooseberry growers that this tends to be one of the worst problems, because a lot of times this disease has the gooseberry plants completely defoliated by the time that the middle of the summer comes around. And so it weakens the plant, and it's not good. The defoliation isn't as bad on black currants, but it's the worst on gooseberries and red currants. And okay, there's a picture of what it looks like. You just get these black spots and yellowing of the leaves until the leaves finally just fall off. This is a gooseberry plant that's been affected by it, and you can see almost all the leaves have been lost, and you can imagine how that debilitates the plant. Powdery mildew is also a problem. There are sprays that can control it. And in fact, a lot of the spray programs that control powdery mildew will also control anthracnose. And so this is, you try to get resistant varieties, which is good because they're not as affected by this. And that's another point that I want to make too, is there's a difference between resistant varieties and immune varieties. In the case of white pine blister rust, I don't like to discuss this very much with the foresters because they'll say, okay, we're going to just ban everything. But to have a resistant variety resistant to white pine blister rust is worse, because that means that it doesn't get killed by the white pine blister rust. The plant is resistant. It can have infections. The infections can then multiply and send out their spores to complete the cycle. If you have a susceptible variety, the leaves usually fall off and the plant will eventually die. If you have an immune variety, then that means that it doesn't get the disease, and so then that stops the disease cycle. The problem is that immunities tend to be lost over time, and the CR gene, which was the immunity variety in Titania, which is a common variety recommended, has been lost. So it's susceptible. It's not immune to white pine blister rust anymore. But the same thing, I just wanted to mention that when I talk about immune and resistant varieties. And in the case of powdery mildew, I know that we have some immune varieties, and I have not seen that that immunity has been broken down. This is the other big problem for gooseberry growers. It also can get onto red currants and cause a problem, but these imported currant worms, again, can completely defoliate a plant if you don't watch. There are usually 2 or 3 hatches of these during the season, and the first hatch happens like right around Memorial Day, and then another one a few weeks later. But again, it's a pest. It's easy to control with insecticides, but it's very devastating on the plants if you don't control it. Big bud mite we don't have here. Supposedly, you can see how the buds turn enlarged, and that's because they're infected with mites in the inside. This is what it looks like pulled off of the plant. And reversion virus, again, we really don't want to have that here. It's a virus that makes the plant unproductive, and it's, like I say, it's a problem in black currants, never been seen in gooseberries. There's a good book that was put out a number of years ago now by Barney and Hummert called Currants and Gooseberry Production Guide. Also, there's some good information on the USDA site. And I guess, Laura, we're open for questions now.
All right, thanks very much, Steve. We do have a couple of things in the chat box that we'd like to ask you specifically about. First, when you were describing how you get the gooseberries or currants through that heat treatment, it's kind of an infusion or a steaming treatment, I think. Mm-hmm. And Stephen, you have to stop sharing, at which I stop participants sharing.
Yeah, that's what I want. I couldn't find it. Is it taken care of?
It's taken care of. We did.
I'm sorry.
I should have done that myself. Sorry.
Okay.
I just am wondering if you could describe that extraction process for us, how you're using the juice and things.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's so key to being successful at a local level. One of the problems that we have with these fruits is marketing, and people are not familiar with the products. And so if you try to sell on a big scale all over New York or something like that, you're going to fall flat on your face because people don't recognize what the products are. So the place to start is on your own place. A steam kettle, I picked up a couple of steam kettles for like around $1,000. They're 35-gallon steam kettles off of eBay. So you can take even a small room, a 12 by 12 room, and just make it so that it fits the standards of the ag and markets, like having easily cleanable walls and floor. So anyway, then you can take your black currants, washed black currants, you put them in there, and it's pound per pound, I found, is the best for the fruit. And this can be used for aronia. This can be used for really any fruit. And that's how I have this line of syrups that we sell. And so what you do is you just heat the product to about 160 to 180 degrees. and leave it there for about 24 hours to 48 hours. And that process just takes place. And then what you do is you just extract the juice or the syrup out of the bottom of the kettle, and you're left with the fruit, which you can then put into a convection oven or a dryer if you have one, and dry that fruit.
All right, so hopefully that helped. A steam kettle, Jennifer, is something that's very commonly used in processing. So I think if you even Google that, you could probably come up with some pictures and information about that. We do have some questions. Let me try to go back.
I see pound per pound. What does that mean? It says 1 pound. It would be 1 pound of fruit for 1 pound of grape juice concentrate. So a gallon weighs around 11 or 12 pounds. And so you can kind of just estimate it. It's not exact, but it's around there.
Do you mind if I ask, because I'm so curious about this, because we grow black currants and I've tried to juice them and I've tried to dry them, and I'm just like not following your instructions very well. I have a steam juicer, but if I use that, what's left is like pale skin bags. So
right.
So the steam kettle must be a different thing.
Yeah.
When I try to dry them, they just turn into like hot jelly bags.
Yeah.
So, and then I missed the part about the grape juice.
Yeah, if I had that, what I would probably do would be to try to make fruit leather out of it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But you have your presses. That's one way of taking the juice out, where they add anyway, they heat it and then they press it. My method is to just take the fruit without stems, all clean, and put it into the steam kettle, which is a big jacketed kettle. And for every pound of fruit, you use 1 pound of syrup. So if I put 11 pounds of fruit in, I'll put about a gallon of syrup in. And
grape syrup, you're saying?
Deionized grape juice syrup. Mm-hmm. And deionization, the name sounds bad and it doesn't necessarily look good on a label, but it's really a process that takes out the flavor of the grapes so that it doesn't taste like grapes. So when you add it, it's kind of like a neutral fruit, and it sweetens the currants, and so then the syrup that comes out is really nicely flavored black currant. But the key is to not boil it, don't overheat it, and just let that process take place over a couple of days.
All right, I'm going to
my trade secrets.
I'm just going to jump in with some horticultural thanks, Jennifer. There was a question about whether or not wild currants and gooseberries could be substantial sources of inoculum for planted, for plantings.
No, because, well, I guess if they're close by and if it's in the uridial stage, and that the pines have already inoculated the local currants, then they could go over onto cultivated currants. But again, if you keep that, if you keep a buffer zone around there of about 1,000 feet, that'll eliminate those problems.
All right, thanks. And then we're talking about, can you cordon a plant without trellising it, or the fruit weight pull down the plant? Is there another way to prune for thorn reduction that doesn't involve trellising?
Yeah, there's staking methods. I mean, if you wanted just to have a single cordon, you could put a stake in there in the ground and then train it up that stake and then have it come. This is probably going to be more expensive than trellising. Bamboo poles. I was just at Whistler Gardens this past year and saw that they opened up their plants by using stakes. And so they had about 4 or 5 stakes to make it so it was open so you could reach your hands down inside there. But again, trellising and cutting back to 1-year-old wood, on those cordons is probably going to be the most practical way to do it. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I had muted it because I had a phone call. There was a question about cultivars, like cultivars that you would have specifically recommended. Do you have a list of, we have some of those resources are on the Teachable website.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
believe so. But I mean, like I say, I use Titania. If you want a fresh black currant, Ben Nevis has been one that's been used because of the large size fruit. I'm working on developing a sweet, large size fruit for out of hand eating, which hopefully is going to be available on the market in a couple of years also. As far as gooseberries are concerned, I did mention that Langley gauge. One problem is that they're not widely available. There's a producer in Oregon called, and her name is Lucille Whitman. And I noticed this morning when I was looking at what varieties were available, that she had that variety available. But if you go to Norse Farms, Tixia is a really nice red variety. Jean is another variety that's really good for gooseberries. And Invicta. Invicta has a lot of thorns, but the fruit it's a green fruit that's good. I'm working also on trying to develop tissue cultured gooseberry plants and more red currant plants that will hopefully become available over the next few years. I think I mentioned already the varieties of red currants, the progression, Jonker Van Tetz, Rovada, Tetran. That's the best.
Yeah, and I'll make sure that those lists of varieties are there because it's really difficult to talk about variety selection in this type of course because there's so much variation according to what you're using the plant for. So I think that we'll move on a little bit. I'm sorry to do that to you guys, but I did want to, there was another question about bird netting and deterring birds from any of these things. Bird netting is, I would think, the preferred method, but there's lots of other things to use or to try. There are some deterrent sprays that have been mostly not, they just don't stay long enough. You have to keep reapplying. There are noise makers and things. And I will put the resource, there's a really good resource from New Hampshire that I'll make sure is on the Teachable site too, because it's a whole bulletin about different ways to deter birds.
And on ribes, I've not had a problem with birds.
Okay, there you go.
There were a lot of, there's a lot of discussion from the foresters. Oh, the birds are going to come. They're going to take those black currant seeds. They're going to spread them all over the forest, and we're going to kill all of the white pines. And it just doesn't happen. People need to open their eyes and observe a little bit even.
This is Eric. I would also agree with that. I have a lot of different kinds of berries and fruits, and many have become a problem, but for whatever reason, they have not with the birds so far. Of course, sometimes, it takes a few years for birds to catch on to something, and then once they know about it, they change their behavior patterns. But so far, they haven't touched those.
Squirrels tend to be more of a problem, like on gooseberries. If you've got trees around and you've got squirrels around, that's a problem with gooseberries.
Great, thanks very much.
Even the deer won't eat black currants.
Correct.
And maybe Steve, you could mention, or even Eric or Roger, the diseases when you plant a variety of berries instead of the monoculture planting. And I will say that there are some diseases that monocultures really exacerbate, but for the most part, it's about air movement and just keeping the planting opened up. And a lot of your fungal diseases, which are mostly fruit diseases, are going to be controlled that way. And I don't know if rust would be helped much if you did interplantings with other, I kind of think not.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
You either have it or you don't. It either comes or it doesn't. And then it depends on what the weather is like, how the movement of that of those spores is going to go, because there's all those different forms that it has to go through,
right,
in order to propagate itself.
There's a question about de-stemming the fruit. And do you have any thoughts on how to do that efficiently?
Well, see, as far as black currants go, I've used commercial black currants that have been destemmed, but blueberry destemmers people tend to use for black currants and aronia berries. I know an aronia grower who just bought a destemmer and he said it worked perfectly for his aronia berries.
It's great. What about vegetative production of ribes? Do you suggest layering or cutting, using layering or cutting techniques?
For black currants, all you have to do is make a cutting of 1-year-old wood and stick it in the ground or stick it in water and it roots. That's not a problem. And then with red currants, you just have to accept the fact that they don't, cuttings don't do as well. You're only going to get 50 to 80% rooting. And gooseberries, if you do that, you're going to get, like, maybe if you're lucky, 5 or 10% rooting. So with gooseberries, you have to take the shoot tips and stick them into the ground in the fall, like say maybe in August or so, and cover them up and they'll develop roots. Or to develop those stool beds where you have a mother plant and you cut it back every year and it sends out more branches every year and it'll become a better source of cuttings each year as it gets bigger. But it just has to do with mounding the soil or mulch or planting soil around it, and so that it can root during the season.
All right, great. And some of this, a lot of, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Michael Durr's book. He has a compendium book that talks about propagation of virtually every woody plant grown in the United States, and that can be very helpful, from doing vegetative to even how to handle seed germination and things. So Michael Durr, D-I-R-R, it's a compendium handbook. There is a question about if you know of a resource comparing nutrient values of these fruit, and I think I might be able to find something, but if any of you guys know of something offhand.
I gave you one to post also that has some charts on it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Maybe
so
that's in the Teachable.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, that's there.
All right. We'll do our best to make sure you have
I think also we need to really remember that it's against the law to promote these things as high antioxidant fruits, because there's a lot more research to be done still as to how much of the antioxidant is actually absorbed through your intestines without being broken down. I mean, there's a lot of, a lot of you might be familiar with Currant C with Greg Quinn, because I worked a lot with him when I was in Co-op Extension. And he was going to be sued by FDA because he was making claims about high antioxidant. And then he asked the question, well, why is it that Palm Wonderful can advertise about high antioxidant and he can't, So anyway, it's a kind of thing where you're not supposed to, like, put on the label a comparison of the antioxidant, the ORAC values of these fruits.
Oh, really? I did not know that. And I actually don't understand, if you just list what their antioxidant rate is, you're not making any claims.
No, if you just list the rate, that would be fine, but you can't be comparing it, because if you start doing that, then the FDA gets upset.
Okay. Yikes. All right, let me just make sure we're getting all of these. There's more comments about chipmunks and birds, and I don't really, I think we're just going to have to put that information up there. That's a whole workshop series in and of itself. The white pine blister rust, they're just checking. Is it true that white pine blister rust does not move from pine to pine?
It's true. It does not move from pine to pine.
Right. Okay. What are the chances of good cultivars arising from bird planted currants? That's an excellent question. I think the chances are
possible.
Yeah. I mean, it's an open pollinated variety that.
Think about it. How many, when they do breeding programs, they plant literally thousands of seeds, and they'll go back and pick 1, 2, 3, 4 here and there. So, it's a chance thing that needs a lot of number to it.
Yeah. We have a question from Lori about recommendations for weed control. Lori, I will point out, and we'll try to put a link that you can purchase the berry crops guidelines, which are revised every single year. And I know that Stephen had his hand in putting together the rabies chapter, which hasn't changed a whole lot, but there are herbicides that are available that are legal to use for in New York State on rabies. And if you follow those label directions closely, but doing that pre-plant preparation to try to make sure you get as many of the perennial weeds that exist out of the field prior to planting is super important. And then from an organic standpoint, using a weed barrier like landscape fabric or like a plastic mulch even in the early portion of the planting, early couple first years is very helpful. People have used cardboard, they've used paper mulch, all kinds of things, organic mulch, and then just try to do a very light cultivating to try to keep the planting free of weeds in the very beginning. That's when it's most important that you really manage weeds.
I swear by the wood chips still.
Wood chips, yeah, wood chips, thick enough to make a difference. I think that's important. And then vinegar, and if you have to, as a burn down between that, really important that kind of edge between the mulch and the ground cover that you have in the alley. That also really helps. And you can use vinegar to try to help with that if you're organic, but if you are, you know, non-selective herbicide like glyphosate that is applied with a wick applicator, you don't get drift on these plants. That can be used as well.
There's another organic option as well. I'm not sure what the label says about use in this particular case, but the pelargonic acid or nonanoic acid products are looking to be a lot more effective than vinegar. So that would be something like, I think Axe is an OMRI approved one, and Miramichi Green is another one. And in my own trials that I have done, they are way better than vinegar solutions, both in terms of effect and cost.
Yeah, and applicator safety, I think.
Yeah.
The vinegar is really nasty.
Yeah, and the cool stuff about the pelargonic acids is that they're a natural occurring essential fatty acid that's already in every plant. So the environmental pathways of breaking it down are, very well established. So it basically has a very short and benign half-life. So it's not an ecological concern.
Thanks, Eric. Adrian has a question about genetically engineered cultivars of rabies. I would think that they would be extremely far down on the list of any plants that we will see. I don't know what you think, Steve, but I just can't imagine we're going to see them right away.
Yeah, I haven't heard of anything at all along those lines.
And after the bushes are established, will they produce well by just mowing down the walkways to keep weeds down? And I think controlling the alleyway ground cover is definitely important just to try to keep disease managed better and just your comfort of moving in the planting. I don't think that necessarily guarantee good production. I think that's what you're talking about.
I'll share one idea here. So it depends, of course, on what scale you're looking at. If this might not apply if you're talking about acres of ribes, but in a pretty even substantially large planting, because grass, if you're managing organically, because stoloniferous grasses are such a problem and they end up coming in, and if your walkway is covered with grass, what I do in my plantings is every couple years, the pathways get dug down to topsoil, and the topsoil gets flipped up onto the beds and recovered with mulch, and then the pathways are just mulch. So it's essentially you're walking on wood chips that are inoculated with, stropharia and other fungi that are breaking down, and that's turning into soil that you're going to flip onto the beds because, as Stephen shared as well, you can cover the crown of these plants with material and it pretty much invigorates them. It doesn't hurt them. So, and it smothers a lot of other weeds out in the process, as long as you keep it really mulched. And it is a pretty, what I'm describing is a pretty labor intensive process, but you don't have to do it every year. And if you get grass, perennial grasses into the row, good luck. You know, it's not a fun time.
Yeah, really hard to control. Thanks, Eric. I also want to try to, Brian has a couple of questions. First, you had a question, Brian, I think on trying to find cropland that was good. That's a real challenge. Good and affordable is a real challenge. There's a fair amount of cropland that's out there that's highly valued by all kinds of different sources, but I don't have a tip except to kind of dig down locally. Visit your county extension office and see if you can find anybody that has any tips on farms that might be for sale. Anything that you talking to realtors, but making sure that they understand that you're looking for agricultural land. There are some good realtors that do focus on ag land. Going to your, if you have a land conservancy organization, they are often very, very focused on trying to get farmers to purchase farmland. That's their whole mission, and keep it in farming. So those kinds of organizations are really, really helpful. So hopefully that will help. And I don't know where you're from, but we do have Janet Britt, who's on this webinar, is actually from ASA, the Ag Stewardship Association in Eastern New York. And she might, if you chatted with her privately, she might be able to help you find a group local to you.
I see a question also about Yostaberries, so I might just mention briefly about that.
Yeah, please go ahead. That was next. That was next.
Okay. Yostaberries tend to be not very productive, okay? And I knew a grower who was in Western Pennsylvania who just swore by the fruit. And they said that it made the best jam, especially when they combined it with other ribes. And so they said, even though it was a poor producer, that they would just grow it because they had such a demand for it, but it took a lot more space because it was less productive. But flavor-wise, that was a winner.
Yeah, and it's funny, isn't it, that I think the calls and the interest in Yostaberries are primarily from Western New York and Western PA. They've got a real following there. I get very few questions from consumers or growers beyond that kind of very distinct region.
They're used for rootstock also sometimes.
Oh, okay. Do we have any other questions? I think we got most of them. We've got lots to talk about tomorrow: aronia, elderberry, and hardy kiwi or Chinese kiwi berries. We will try to make sure some of these resources are up on the Teachable website. And I just want to remind people, the Teachable site is going to be available to you for probably 6 months to a year. You can download things and save them for yourself if you'd like, or you can just keep revisiting that for the next 6 months minimum. Eric, you have a question about, tell us how to protect them, and I'm not sure, protect what exactly?
Also, Yostaberry is used as a rootstock for the other ribes. That was a question in there, I see.
Yeah.
Protect, was it what I was talking about in terms of the grasses?
I don't know. Eric, you can unmute yourself and just fill us in about that question.
Oh, I thought you were talking about me, Eric.
No, it's Eric Pollock. He chatted in the chat box. Just can't figure out what it is.
I haven't had to protect my current species plants from basically anything. I mean, we were talking before about the birds not being such an issue. I've never had a deer or a rabbit eat a black currant shoot ever. I've never seen that. So, I mean, they're very aromatic. In fact, it seems like they may protect other plants because they're so aromatic. I mean, and that might be another potential avenue for sales is if you do have cut flowers, there may be a lot of opportunities to prune some of these woody perennials that we're going to be talking about in the next couple days and include them. The smell of a black currant shoot, even in the middle of winter when there's no greenery on it, is heavenly. It's truly phenomenal. So there may be some other creative uses there.
That's
I feel like
a
aronia
good
is
point.
quite fragrant too. I think aronia has a really nice smell.
Yeah, some people love black currant. Some people hate that smell.
Well, they're wrong. So
yeah, well, I love it. I personally love it also. But they talk about the cat piss odor and then the fragrant odor, because the French people made perfume using the more positive odor, not using the cat piss fraction. So that was kind of interesting. But also your idea about cut, like for cut flower arrangements, I have in the past also sold cut red currants and cut black currants to put in flower arrangements. So if you have mature stems and you want to just sell the stems, that's a great marketing thing, Eric.
Laura, this is Roger. I was going to just tag in with Eric a little bit. 1 year here at the berry farm, we got a good deal on some mulch hay that had already like sprouted out and then died off. And we put deep cardboard and the mulch hay down between the rows. And that really helped, like what Eric was saying about the perennial grasses. It really smothered them out. And haven't got that kind of deal on the mulch hay anymore, but that really worked for that year and really brought up our soil. The value really became a lot better too. So
yeah,
I'm not sure if that'll help, but
I really have, I think for these kind of crops, I've been going in that direction more to not really look at the walkway as something that you only walk on. I'm trying to manage the walkway as something that's actively building soil, that's part of the system. It provides, when you mulch the walkway, it provides an enormous amount of moisture retention. So if you have a mulched walkway that's, a lot of mine are 8 inches thick, deep of wood chips all the way down to subsoil. And that provides an incredible benefit for soil life, moisture retention. It's a fertility bank. And so I kind of would rather go a little bit more intensive and have the whole garden be heavily mulched like that and cultivate a smaller area rather than have a more extensive planting with mown strips in between, because it just causes more problems as far as I've experienced.
Yeah, it is so hard to control that mowed alleyway. And if you don't have to do it for whatever, I mean, I think most pick your owns try to have it just because that's what the expectation, but
Right.
I agree with you. I think not having it, and the roots of the plants are definitely out in the alleyway, so why not mulch it? Thank you guys. We have a couple more minutes, and we did have another question about chemicals in the cardboard. Basically, the thing we mostly worry about, I think, is less about the chemicals in the cardboard, but chemicals in the ink. And that can sometimes be a challenge, but I don't believe in the cases that they have discussed it would be really anything detrimental. If you were going to keep using it over and over and over, like paper mulch, is, especially newsprint, has been kind of identified as a possible environmental problem. I did try to think of one other thing about mulches and kind of the negative aspects of mulches, but it just flipped out of my mind. So let's go keep trying to.
And I wanted to add in also, there's something here about the flavor of the stems of black currants. I forgot to mention also that black currant leaves are used in black currant tea. So that's another, and there's a certain demand for that here also in areas where Europeans live, fresh immigrants. Snails was another question. I know we had that as a major problem here with one of our commercial growers of black currants in Columbia County. And they drove the harvester over and they had half snails, half half black currants. So they ended up using snail bait, which took care of the problem. But organically, I don't know of any organic snail baits that are available. Safers has one, but it's not organic.
Sluggo is actually OMRI approved, and it's an iron phosphide that actually does a really good job. And if you make sure to understand that life cycle of a snail, so they're doing all their they're laying their eggs in the fall. So if you can get that bait down early and try to kill off the adults before they deposit their eggs, you might gradually be able to reduce the overall population.
We do an herbal tea here on the farm. I think Steve, we mentioned, my wife called it Russian lady tea because that's who recommended it to us. And so we started selling that last year, and it's one of our new hits. So yeah, very, very good.
Yeah.
Is that with currants?
Black currant leaves.
Black currant leaves, yes.
Nice. A living mulch is always a consideration, Julie. I think that when you're talking, usually we talk about the living mulch in the alleyway. I don't know of anybody that's growing a living mulch right under and in the planting row. I think that because these are so shallow rooted, it could be really detrimental in terms of water and nutrients. I don't know if Eric, Roger, Stephen, you have any comments about that?
There are those
Yeah.
creeping grasses that might be a possibility to use that aren't very deep rooted.
Really low, yeah.
Yeah, that creeping fescue, I think is called. That might be a possibility, no?
Yeah, it is definitely shallow rooted, but it still requires quite a bit of nutrients. So I am hesitant to recommend that. It's something you could play with, but.
Well, the thing is that when, a lot of mulches require nutrients, and this is one of the things why I guess I'm organic, except for the fact that I believe in using chemical fertilizers to boost the growth of my organic plants. And so if you use them properly and don't destroy the soil microorganisms by over fertilizing, I think that chemical fertilizers definitely have a place. But yes, so as you cut that grass or you cut that mulch, those nutrients are recycled, and that's the natural thing that happens in nature. Generally, is the weeds suck up the nutrients, they go back into the ground when they die. So it's a way of preserving the nutrients in a way.
And there's some really good suggestions for some of the plants that you could use, like comfrey. That's a great suggestion, Eric. Thanks. Clovers, I would be worried about because they are quite deep rooted and they can become really challenging. They do obviously fix nitrogen, so they're a really good source that way, but I think they would be very competitive in the row. I do know of some that have living alleyways, like a living mulch right in between some other crops, and that has worked fairly well for people. But I don't see it routinely, and so it would really have to be something you would work out in your own system.
Yeah, I definitely prefer mulches to any of those other living mulches under the row. Is it seems like it has a lot of potential to go wrong in a lot of ways, with root zone and nutrient competition, and then also usually they're going to grow up more than a few inches, and then they're going to change the airflow, and so you could get more pest and disease problems. Yeah, I found under woody perennials, a heavy mulch of ideally woody based or sometimes hay based, depending on what you have access to, is definitely preferable to living mulches from what I've observed.
All right, great. And Eric asks that question about ways to deter things without killing them. And that's a great question, but a lot of what we do is deterrent, but there are certainly things that, part of the deterrent is to kill off some of the population. So I don't know if that is directed at the snails, but think we've gotten, there is a question about if you have white pine blister rust already, how do you get rid of it? We do have some fungicides that might help with that, but I don't know if that's really going to completely, you know, eradicate it if you have both hosts right there.
Well, and remember that the pine trees can be 350 miles away, so you're stuck
It's
with
really
it.
hard, really hard. Inoculating wood chips. Was that
I
from
don't
a conversation?
inoculate my wood chips. I just sprinkle some chemical fertilizer over the top, and that allows those microorganisms to grow because it gives them the nitrogen that they need in order to be able to break down the cellulose.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, maybe you're also referring, David, to just, or Andrew, you know, if you're composting things, you can buy commercial inoculants that are basically just, you know, bacteria. They're kind of like a starter that will help the breakdown commence. So maybe that's a fungi inoculant. Yeah.
The way to rejuvenate a 10 or 15-year-old currant bush is just basically cut it to the ground and it'll grow back up. You can mow it off. I mean, in fact, that's one of the ways that they do it in Europe is they'll go down those long rows and they'll just take a mower and they'll mow the currant plants off in order to, they lose a year of production, a year or two of production, but economically, rather than spending the money on having people go through and spot prune, that's the way that they do it.
Yeah. The alternate year, you know, fully getting rid of, or kind of a full pruning is used in raspberries and blackberries and things too. So, and Liam is pointing out that Eric might have mentioned Stropharia, which is a mushroom that might kind of accelerate the breakdown of those wood chips.
Yeah, they accelerate the breakdown, and they also do have some predatory action against certain plant pathogenic nematodes. So, and the fungi are edible. So, to whatever extent you actually eat the fungi, I don't know, but it does have a lot of different benefits. And it's so easy. Once you get one little bit of inoculated wood chips, you have it for the rest of your life. You just put it in a fresh pile of wood chips every few years, and it takes over the whole thing.
All
and
right, well,
it keeps a lot of moisture in there as well, rather than just having regular wood chips. They can dry out, but if they're inoculated, they stay much more moist.
it's great. Such great information. I
And
really
we had those come up on their own.
Oh,
We didn't inoculate them. They're just everywhere now. We sell them.
nice. So folks, we're gonna meet right back here tomorrow and the next 3 days. I am very happy to have such a great group join us. And Stephen, thank you so very much for the presentation. We look forward to hearing from you tomorrow. Thanks, Eric and Roger, for joining us. And we will, for those of you who can't make all 4 of these, we'll try to get the recording posted on the Teachable as soon as possible, the day of the presentation, so that you can listen to it, and have a great day digging out for those of you who've got a lot of snow. All right, take care.
Thanks, everybody.